Today's lesson is about right hand movement when playing across the strings. This is especially during scales, but also other textures like small group arpeggios that travel across the strings as well. So when we move across the strings, like there are certain questions about the movement of the arm. Does the arm move like this, or does it just kind of pivot, or does it stay completely static and still? And when moving across the strings, there are three concepts that are usually taught by instructors, either exclusively, so using just one of the methods, or in combination. So let me just tell you what the three things are and then what I'll do in the video. So the first one is a perfect hand position. So just a perfect hand position, and then the arm just moves that hand around. So if I was playing across the strings, the arm here is physically moving back and forth across the guitar. The second one is when you're centered on the fourth and third strings, a small pivot in the arm and wrist allows you to play on all the different string groups without actually moving the arm across the strings. The third way, again, when you're centered on those inner strings, a small extension of the fingers or contraction of the fingers allows you to keep a static hand position but reach those strings with the fingers themselves. Each of these ways have advantages and disadvantages. After I go through each of those in more detail, I will tell you how I teach my students and why I teach them that way. So make sure you stay to the end. I'll also cover some basic exercises that you can practice. I'll be using exercises from my technique book. There's a link for that book in the description, but you can just grab the exercises from the video or use whatever technique book you have around, or you can just use scales for it as well. Okay, so I'm going to go over the three different methods or the concepts. So the first one is having a perfect hand position and then using arm movement to bring that perfect hand position around to the different strings. Keep in mind that we're talking about playing across the strings here, like you would in a scale. Just like playing across the strings. We're not talking about static arpeggios where the hand would remain in just one position. So in this method, keeping the perfect hand position but using the arm to move it around, there's some real advantages. It makes sense because once you've zeroed in on the perfect hand position and finger motion, it will be the same on every string. The motion you use on the sixth string will be the same as the motion you use on the first string. Everything is like exactly the same, so there's a consistency in the muscle memory of this method that make it very stable, secure, and ergonomic. There's some issues with relaxation in the arm movement itself if the student is tense, though. And also in terms of being ultra secure, motion can destabilize sometimes. Now, this method is actually the way I teach at first, but I'm going to talk about that later because I actually also introduce combination stuff, but we will discuss that later. The second way is centered small wrist and arm pivots. So when we're centered on the inner strings, like the fourth and third string, with a small pivot in our arm, just like a pivot in our arm and wrist, we can reach all the different string groups without physically moving the arm in this way, in this sawing kind of motion. So this has the advantage of being very static. It's like you're statically locked there and you're just kind of like pivoting a little bit. So that's the advantage of that one. But nevertheless, it does feel a little bit different. This feels different than it does in these other spots. Because it's not exactly the same arm and hand position. The third way is that, again, if you're centered on the fourth and third strings, you could either extend your fingers out or contract them in. So in this one, you're keeping a static hand position even, and just extending the fingers or contracting them. Again, the advantage here is that your hand is in a static, stable position, but the disadvantage is that like you're no longer playing with like a perfect finger motion. Suddenly you're like playing up here uses extended fingers and playing down here uses contracted fingers. It's not exactly, it doesn't feel exactly the same. So I'm now going to talk about how I teach my students and why. But before I do that, I just want to mention something, is that each of the methods can change slightly depending on what the musical texture is. When we're playing just across the strings, from the 6th string to the 1st string, some of these methods will be more useful than others. When we're skipping back and forth between the strings, other methods will be useful. When we're playing arpeggios, other things will be useful. So there's a lot of context needed and a lot of subtleties involved in the motions to make sense of them. So let me first tell you about how I teach. So I use the first one. Try to teach the perfect hand position with arm movement. So if we're playing scales, I try to teach that perfect hand position. So like, really using the finger in a certain way where the finger goes in towards the palm. There's lessons for my right hand technique on the site. You can check that out. There's a link for that in the description. This is not a video on that topic specifically. We're just talking about across the strings. So in that first way, like we really like zero in on what a good right hand position is. And then we just let the arm just move that around. Making it feel the same here as it does here. So I teach this until the student has a really strong foundation and muscle memory, and they have a certain amount of relaxation built into their playing. However, at later stages, they can utilize all 3 of those different ways of playing depending on the musical texture and as they become more relaxed. In general, as a student becomes much more relaxed, but also stable in their technique, they incorporate a lot of these things very naturally without me really having to teach it too much. The subtleties of movements become, they get access to that subtlety. When I'm teaching beginner students, the beginner students generally don't have a lot of subtleties yet. They're working on foundational skills and security and the bigger things, but like tiny, like subtle complexities, they're just not really there yet. And also introducing 3 different concepts and telling them when to use them is quite complex. So usually I teach that perfect hand position with arm movement, and then we move on from there. I think that this builds really strong foundational skills, and then the subtleties of the different motions can come into action later. I'm not criticizing any of the different methods. Teachers have good success teaching with each one and then branching out from those areas. So this just happens to be the way that I teach and that I've had success with. Other teachers might do it differently. Let's now go over a couple of exercises so I can explain more context. I can show you some exercises where arm movement is particularly beneficial. I can show you some exercises where the pivot is particularly useful. And then I can show you some where the extension and contraction of the fingers is useful, although that is the most subtle of them all. Hopefully. I'm going to be using some exercises from the beginning of my technique book. In the beginning of my technique book has 100 open string exercises for the right hand. Very useful for just focusing on right hand technique. So in particular in my book, number 5 to 23 deal with playing across the strings in melodic textures, so similar to scales, in a lot of detail. So numbers 5 to 23 are particularly useful. But like I said, you can use any scale or technique exercises that you like. You can also just copy what I do in the video. Okay, so when we're playing just directly across all 6 strings, at don't know if you noticed, but the range that I was moving my arm on the guitar was like from here to here. It was just like when I was on the first string, I was up there. When I was on the lowest string, I was down here. So there's actual physical movement on the arm for that exercise. That's exercise number 6. And that's just playing triplets on each string. So I find the arm movement particularly useful there because when I play also, I start much more ponticello and end up more tosto, so that thin E string sounds nice and warm. Very useful when you have, if you're playing in that direction, you can have just like that perfect hand position and just move it from this string all the way down to this string, and it feels the same. So in that particular exercise, I utilize that first method of arm movement to its maximum. But let's check out a different exercise. So for example, if we look at an exercise like exercise number 11, in this exercise we skip strings, so we play the 6th string, 4th string, 5th, 3rd, 4th, 2nd, 3rd, 1st. In this one, the huge range of arm motion isn't as useful because we're always going back and forth. It would be a lot of seesawing motion back and forth like this. So in this one, I use much more of the arm pivot, just a subtle movement so I can get back to each one. So not a lot of arm motion. I probably went from using this one in the previous exercise to like this much in this one. So I'm combining those two, but I'm much more on the pivot here because of the back and forth motion of the texture. So in this texture, you know, that second concept is just, it's a little bit more of use. And certainly when we have like other exercises, such as extension exercises themselves. So like, for example, in my number 17, exercise number 17, I do some extension work, like where I'm playing on a static string, and then I upper string, static. Certainly in that exercise, because I'm so focused on this string, the finger extension technique is more useful here. So here, having a static hand position and extending the fingers outward, that's more useful in this particular technique situation because I need the stability. I don't want to be going, you know, doing big motions for this, like this subtle, intricate little texture. So what you've learned is that those 3 exercises I showed you all are benefited by using one of the different concepts. When I teach though, like I said, I teach that arm motion with a perfect hand position first until we're really locked into it. And then we just start adding some subtleties depending on the musical texture. So we really just like, we build this foundational technique around a concept of a good hand position. And then we can slowly, not break the rules, but we can slowly add subtleties to that based on the situation. So the reason I made this video is that people write into the site all the time asking like, what do I do with my arm? Do I do this, or do I just pivot, or do I keep my hand perfectly still? The answer is much more complex than that. As you become more advanced, the musical textures become more advanced and more varied, and then you have to apply a little bit more subtlety to the concepts. You don't want any of this to confuse you though. You want a perfect hand position, and then as you become more advanced, subtleties of variation in movement become accessible to you. That's the only thing you have to remember. But I hope you found that to be a useful discussion in the different concepts and the different musical textures that we might use them in.